If you're a Catholic who's been going to the traditional Latin Mass, you probably noticed a lot of people are reading from these big books during the Mass. They're reading from a Missal. It's a large book containing prayers, readings, and rubrics authorized by the Roman Catholic Church for the celebration of the Mass. If you've never had one, do have one, and want a new one, or are just curious about what they contain, this video is for you. We're going to be looking at the most popular Latin missals you can buy today and which is the, quote, best. In this video, we're going to be comparing the missals with each other and ultimately which is the best bang for your buck. I hope to do more videos like these in the future, plus videos regarding the faith, so don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now, in my personal experience, I'm just going to be straightforward and say it. I know a lot of people might love these missals, and so do I. But the truth, how I see it, is no missal is perfect. There may be some that you like, some that you prefer over the others, maybe some that are perfect for you, but overall, there's no perfect missal. In my opinion, there's always something missing, confusing, frustrating, and you'll have to compromise from time to time, but don't let that get you down. All of these missals are great options if you're really serious about following the Mass or if you want to strengthen your prayer life. Now, let's get started. These are the top missals that you can buy brand new. The Father Lasance Missal, the Angelus Press Missal, the new Marian Missal, the Baronius Press Missal, and the Stedman Missal. Starting with the Father Lasance Missal. Now, this is a missal that has been around for a while. It was written by Father Francis Xavier Lasance, a talented American priest from the mid-18 and 1900s, who has also authored many other manuals and writings to assist the faithful. This missal is popular among many traditional Catholics because it's a pre-1955 missal, meaning it does not have the changes to the Holy Week Mass that were issued during Pope Pius XII's pontificate or the 1962 changes, obviously issued by John XXIII. Now, this may be a positive for some, but also a negative for others. From what I noticed, a majority of Latin Masses that you attend are going to be using the 1962 Missal. Nevertheless, the Father Lasance Missal is a great option, and for most, it's seen as the gold standard of missals. Now, the Missal starts off with a long introduction that has a lot of cool and insightful information, some quotes, small prayers, explanations to the Mass, offerings, study plans, diagrams, illustrations, rubrics, etc., etc., etc. This is great if you want to grow in your faith and understanding, or if you just want to nerd out about what's written in older books or manuals. But probably most people, myself included, won't have the time to go into this section and give it a good read. But if you do have the time, I highly recommend it. The Proper of the Season starts on page 102. Thankfully, this missal has nice, thick paper compared to others, but that means you'll notice the thickness of 102 pages. All of the missals in this video have a good feel to them, and the Lasance Missal is no slouch. You might notice that there are some shortcuts that are made. The cover is not real leather, the binding is a little weaker than some other missals, and the gilding tends to rub off much faster than others. However, for the average user, you probably won't notice most of these things until after a long time of use. What stands out in this missal compared to others is the use of Latin in the Mass readings. Unlike other missals, the Father Lasance will use the same size font for Latin and English. That means all of the readings, all of the Mass readings, the introit, the prayer, the epistle, the gospel, etc., will be translated in Latin and English and will all have them at the same size. Other missals will not have this. With other missals, the Latin will be a little bit smaller, and on some missals that you'll see, they don't even have Latin at all. Most missals will have the introit and the gospel in Latin, but the remaining readings will be English only, so keep that in mind. But of course, for me, this isn't good enough. It's cool that the Latin and the English are the same font size, but the font can be a little small. Other missals will have a larger font for the Mass, one page in English, the other page in Latin, and I love that. This missal, however, is Latin and English right next to each other, and the missal is using a sort of 1940s styled English, Some prayers may read different compared to more modern translations, but that's totally okay. It's not in your face about it, and sometimes I prefer this Missal's English over some of the modern translations. On one page, the Latin will be on the left, and on the next page, the Latin is on the right. Sometimes when I'm reading fast, I get confused. I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking that part. Just something I wanted to mention. I like how on some pages, the Missal will tell you when to stand or kneel. You don't notice it too much throughout the Mass, so it's not as well done as I'd like, but it's still a nice addition. Getting to the preface. Now, most Sundays will have the preface of the Most Holy Trinity, and this Missal has that preface baked into the ordinary. That's awesome. I love that. That way, most of the year, you don't have to go looking through your book to find the most used preface. But right after the Sanctus, the Missal goes to the preface for weekdays. This preface is said throughout the week, but in my real-world experience, you might not end up using that preface a lot. So you have a preface which takes a whole page, and then you'll have to go to a new page, which is a beautiful illustration, but nothing else. And then the following page will have the Mass of the Faithful. So it can be a little frustrating if you're trying to catch up during the Mass. It's just a lot of pages that you'll have to go through. It's a couple of pages that aren't being used for that time, and so it could be a little frustrating. This might be good or bad. Other Missals have a different setup, so ultimately it's really up to the reader. Contrary to what others may have said about this Missal, yes, this Missal does reference pages in the book for other prayers. Now, it doesn't do it anywhere near as much as some of the other Missals will, but this problem is still present, especially throughout the year for specific Masses for saints or bishops or confessors, etc. Thankfully, it's only really noticeable in the Mass readings for feasts or saints that fall on specific dates of the calendar. For example, the Mass devoted to Saint Bibiana on December 2nd only has one dedicated prayer for that holy saint. The introit, epistle, gospel, etc. are on a different page. The good thing is, this doesn't really happen on Sunday readings, unlike some of the other Missals. On some of the other Missals, for the last weeks of Pentecost after the 24th week, you'll have to skim through your book to find the correct reading for that day. But this Missal will have them all, which is very useful for a lot of people. This Missal has it all. Votive Masses, Mass for pilgrims and travelers, all of the Masses for the Blessed Virgin Mary. Please note it does not have a dedicated Mass for Our Lady of Guadalupe, the nuptial Masses, and so on and so forth. Pretty much everything you need. Lastly, you have general devotions. This is starting on page 1787. This Missal has so many different prayers and devotions like litanies, Stations of the Cross, the Rosary, etc. I love to reference Missals for new prayers to learn because you'll usually get the best translation for that prayer. But a huge setback is that all of the prayers are in English only. I'm less than a novice on Latin. I can pronounce words and I can read a little bit, but nothing difficult by any means. Learning the prayers in Latin, for me, is a great way to learn Latin. This Missal will have common prayers in Latin like the Pater Noster, the Confiteor, the Salve Regina, but only because they're included in the Mass and the prayers after the Low Mass. I couldn't find the Ave Maria in Latin. Maybe I missed it. I doubt it, but it's a huge Missal. So if you found it, please leave a comment on what page I can find it in. Ultimately, this is a solid Missal. It's one of the most expensive that you can purchase, but it has so much to offer and it's a great buy. Definitely would recommend it, and I definitely wouldn't have any issues using this as my weekly Missal. Up next, we have one of my favorites, the Angelus Press Missal. Some people might call this the SSPX Missal as well, but for whatever reason for me, it's easier to call it by its publisher's name. It's a 1962 Missal, so it'll work for a majority of traditional Latin Masses that you might attend in the United States. They also have a Spanish translation of this Missal if that's what you're looking for. It has a genuine leather cover, good binding, good quality gold and gilt edges that don't rub off like the Father Lasance Missal. Big font in the middle for the Mass. Honestly, it's got it all. But it's not perfect. Now, I love this Missal. I love all of the Missals that are being reviewed today, but this is probably the number one Missal I can recommend for someone if they want a good Missal for the Mass and if they want to learn their prayers. This missal starts off with a shorter introduction. It's a faster read for most if you're into that. If you're big on illustrations, then I hate to break it to you, but this missal is not it. It's mostly text-based. Most of the illustrations here are pretty small, while the larger illustrations are simply to give emphasis on the liturgical season. After the introduction, you get a part that I really love, titled The Most Necessary Prayers. Now, this portion is going to show all of the main prayers that I think every Catholic should know by heart. The Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be, the Apostles' Creed, the Confiteor, the Acts of Faith, Hope, Charity, Act of Contrition. It shows how to pray the Rosary, it shows the mysteries, the Stations of the Cross, the litanies, and so much more. You might be thinking, but wait, the Lasance Missal has all this too. You're right, but this missal has those prayers, and they're both in English and Latin. For me, I really love that. I think praying in Latin is so powerful, and it helps you draw closer to the faith. One thing to note, this missal uses a very traditional English for some prayers, and sometimes I like it, other times I get a little confused because it's worded so differently compared to the prayers that I'm used to, like in the Nicene Creed. But if you're learning a prayer you've never read before, you won't even notice. I think the layout is just better and easier to get into. You have your main prayers in the beginning, devotions for communion, for confession, hymns, etc. Then finally at page 137, you have the first Sunday of Advent. Now as you can see, we're way past 130 pages, but it's not that thick. Now that's fantastic to keep the size down of the missal, but that's probably the most annoying part of this missal. The pages are super thin. Like, it's crazy how thin these pages are. You can even see the text from the other side of the page. If you have sausage fingers or really dry hands, you might have a problem in the beginning turning the pages. The pages are so thin that sometimes you end up turning 2 pages instead of 1, throwing you way off. I never really had this issue with the Lasance Missal or other missals, but it's a big issue with this one. Over time you get used to it, the gilding wears off a little bit on the corners, and it's easier to turn the page, but in the beginning you'll have an issue. What I did to get started was open the book and just start running through the corners like this. And I also turned the pages one by one until getting to the end. I know, it sounds annoying, but you'll be glad you did it. All of the Mass readings are in English and Latin. Other missals will only have the introit and epistle in Latin, or maybe other readings that are not as long, just as a way to save some space and to have less pages. No, this missal will have them all. Some people say, but the Latin is much smaller. Yeah, it's a little smaller, but it's not that much smaller. Also, most people aren't fluent in Latin, and so the font size isn't going to be their biggest issue. Going to the Mass, I think it's a good setup. It's the most important part of the missal, and so thankfully, it's larger text. Left side is Latin, right side is English. There are some cool notes and explanations that are off to the side that some people may like. I honestly don't really like or care for its placing. I think it takes up way too much space on the page, and you end up having huge blank spots. Important notes and pointers are in red, sometimes in italics, and it just gives you a better understanding of what's going on. As you can see, I've taken it upon myself to put sticky notes on when to stand or kneel during a high Mass. I did this because for some time I was using this missal as a daily reference, reading the prayers, learning Latin, so I wanted something that was going to help me all the time. What frustrates me is this missal, the complete missal, the over $50 missal, does not tell you when to stand or kneel or sit during a high Mass. Now, you might be saying, well, why do you even care so much about this? Because the $6 Sunday Missal does tell you when to stand or sit or kneel during a high Mass. So, I don't know if they didn't realize it or if they just thought, hey, you're buying an expensive missal, you should already know when to stand, kneel, or sit. I don't know. But little things like that get me a little annoyed. I do want to note that for the Gospel, it does say in the largest letters and font possible that you need to stand. Following with that, we have different prefaces that are set for the Mass. This missal has it right in the middle where the Mass for the catechumens and the faithful meet. It's frustrating that the most used preface is a few pages after the Dignum et Justum Est, but it's going in chronological order of the calendar, so that's good. You be the judge. You'll go from page 869 to 883 between the Dignum et Justum Est and the Sanctus, so 14 pages. And remember, the pages are thin, so try not to pass the Sanctus. Continuing, you'll notice the 1962 changes. Here we see a star on the page indicating the addition of St. Joseph's name in the Comunicantes. The following page shows the other Comunicantes that you'll have to say during the year, so that's pretty handy. And the rest is pretty straightforward. Oh yeah, remember those empty spaces I mentioned earlier? Unfortunately, there's a lot of empty spaces in this missal. Some of it is to try to keep everything together. Other times, I think maybe they just kind of didn't notice. But there are a lot of empty spaces in this missal when you're going through it. And you don't have empty spaces like this on some of the other missals that we're looking at. Some people might think that it looks clean. I honestly don't think it looks clean. It looks a little convoluted or a little half-baked. The rest of this missal goes through the calendar. It's different celebrations for the saints, the Blessed Mother, etc. It'll have your votive masses and your various devotions like the 40 Hours devotion, prayers to the Blessed Sacrament, litany of the Most Precious Blood, exorcism prayers. There's a lot. I appreciate that this missal will have the Mass of Our Lady of Guadalupe along with other proper feasts for the United States. So there's so much to go through with this missal. And like I said with the Father Lasance Missal, I don't see why you should have any issue using this missal as your daily or weekly missal. There's some compromise that you'll have to make with this missal, but overall it's a fantastic missal and it's put together well and it's beautiful. I think anybody who purchases this missal will be very happy using it as their daily or weekly missal. And now we have one of my all-time favorites, the new Marian Missal. Now, right off the bat, this missal has a lot of different versions, so it could be a little frustrating if you buy one secondhand. There's a pre-1955 printing with smaller font, a 1958 printing with larger font that I have here, and a 1962 missal which will have interesting font. If you buy the brand new reprint, you'll get the 1958 large font that I'm reviewing right now. As usual, we'll start from the beginning. This missal uses color for its illustrations, and I think that's a nice addition. It gets annoying sometimes because the illustrations are on a much thicker paper than the regular pages, so sometimes it's a little hard to turn the page, or you might even miss your page because of the thickness of the illustration. But nevertheless, it's nice. Now, one thing to remember is on the new reprint of this missal, all of the illustrations are not in color. They're all in black and white. Honestly, it's not a great reprint. Some of the pages are not center on the page, you'll see some weird gaps that don't show up on the original print, and the new reprint has much thinner pages, so you'll have the same issues as the Angelus Press missal with font bleeding through the page. Instead of an introduction, this missal goes on a quick explanation of the liturgy of the Catholic Church. It details what's used in the Mass, but it doesn't show illustrations, just straight text. After that, we're immediately at the proper of the season, starting with Advent. This missal is no joke, it gets right to the point. First hiccup, remember when I said other missals do not have all of the readings in English and Latin? Well, here's what I'm talking about. The introit is English and Latin. The collect, only English. The epistle, only English. The gradual, English and Latin. The gospel, only English. Offertory, English and Latin. Secret, only in English. Communion, English and Latin. Post-communion, only English. And that's throughout the whole missal. Some people don't like that. Honestly, for me, it's a little frustrating, but at the same time, I don't speak or read Latin fluently, so why should I really care? I think it's cool that this missal will have the My Daily Thought section at the end of the Mass readings. It's something that you can use to contemplate if you like to pray after the Mass is over. I think it's a cool addition, so if you have this missal, let me know what you think in the comments. Remember, I'm using the 1958 missal. This is the most common copy of the Missal that you can get, to my knowledge, so it'll have the Holy Week changes. A lot of important days and seasons will give a historical explanation of the importance, so it's cool to read up on those, starting with, let's say, the Holy Week or Pentecost. Now you might be thinking, does this Missal refer you back to other readings like in the extra weeks of Pentecost? Yes. From my use, it's just as much as the Angelus Press Missal. A lot of Masses during the year will have you go back to another reading, but for Sundays you're pretty solid using any of the Missals we've looked at. It's not as big of an issue as some make it seem, but it's still a little annoying when it happens. Mind you, I'm very biased when it comes to this Missal. This was my go-to Missal for probably a full year. I used it all the time because I just loved how easy it was to use. Getting to the Holy Mass, the Missal shows you notes and directions, devotions for confession, prayers before communion, and so on. Next you have the various prefaces, and what a shock! The most used preface, the preface of the Holy Trinity, is the first one. The prefaces are written in both Latin and English, which I love because I can follow along during a high Mass. Outside of the sacrifice, this is my favorite part of the Mass. The way the priest says the antiphon in Latin is just amazing to me. One quick note right before the Asperges: you have a meditation before the Mass with a beautiful indulgence prayer. I'm just going to leave this prayer here for you. You can screenshot or press pause. I think it's a beautiful prayer, and I wish other Missals had this prayer. I've only found it in this specific Missal and the Father Stedman Missal that we'll be reviewing later. Now, getting to the ordinary of the Mass of the catechumens. Now look at how beautiful and clear that looks. You have your red font for notes, thick font in black, Latin on the left, English on the right. I think it's so beautifully done, and it's like that throughout the whole Missal. No annoying empty spaces. Most of the prayers are not cut off or continuing on another page. It's all here formatted for the reader. So as you see here on the public confession, it'll abbreviate the priest's public confession, since we're responding to it, and on the next page it shows the full confession that the faithful profess. I love it. It's clear and it's big. The Missal is called the large font version, and here you see why. The notes and references are noticeable, but not too much. The Nicene Creed is all on one page. I love this. The Angelus Press Missal, the Father Lasance Missal, all of the other Missals, you'll have to turn your page in the middle of the Creed. Not here. Also, one thing to note, this is more of a preference for some. This Missal is written in a more modern English. The Creed you read here will read more close to the modern translations you see today, so keep that in mind. The Angelus Press Missal, as stated earlier, seems to go out of its way to use a more traditional English translation. For me, I prefer this English translation compared to the Angelus Press Missal. On older copies of this Missal, the pages are a little thicker. I have a version where the pages are pretty good in thickness, but not too thick and not too thin. This brown leather version has slightly thinner pages though, and the new reprint has slightly thinner pages than this. They also have more of a softer touch to them on the new reprint. I don't know, for some you might like it, others you may not. Maybe you'll have issues turning the page, I can't tell. This brown leather version I have has good gilding. Most of these Missals will have red edges or red gilding, and that's totally fine. I don't mind that. I think it looks nice. This one, as you can see, has a gold gilding over the red, so you kind of get best of both worlds. At the end of the Mass, you'll have the last Gospel, again, all in one page. The prayers concluding the Mass, and then extra prayers, proper of the saints, pretty much like other Missals, ending with votive Masses and various devotions. Here's where you'll have the major prayers, litanies, hymns, Stations of the Cross, etc. Here's where I have an issue. Throughout the Missal, you'll have different prayers and devotions and responses, and it's cool, but they'll all be scattered throughout the Missal. Unlike the Angelus Press Missal, on this Missal, you'll have to be turning and searching throughout the Missal all the time to find prayers. Prayers before communion is before the Mass, prayers after communion is after the Mass, devotions for First Friday and for Saturday are after those, but the litanies are way in the back of the book. A side note, this is one of the few missals that has a dedicated section to First Friday and First Saturday, so that's a huge plus. But what upsets me more is that the major prayers aren't in Latin. Huge miss. I wish it had both languages, but it is what it is, I guess. Ultimately, I love this missal. If I had to recommend a Sunday missal, I'd recommend this one. Now, if you want all of the bells and whistles and you're going to be reading a missal every day, maybe this might not be your best option, but it's still a great option. But if you go to Latin Mass every Sunday and occasionally go to First Friday or First Saturday, or also occasionally going to the weekday Masses, and not to forget Holy Days of Obligation, this is a perfect buy. It's not too expensive, it's not too big. As you can see, it's much thinner than some of the other missals, and it'll have everything that you need for the Mass. Up next, we have the Baronius Press Missal. This missal is a modern church-approved missal, as it notates in the beginning that it's the Summorum Pontificum edition. It's going to look a lot like the Angelus Press Missal. The setup is very similar. The design is very similar. But there are enough differences to justify purchasing one over the other. Passing the liturgical calendar, you have your prayers for England, Wales, and Scotland, and most importantly, the most necessary prayers. And yes, you have the prayers in both English and Latin. But boo-hoo, the Latin is smaller text. Oh, woe is me, right? One thing to mention about the prayers in English, a lot of them are using modern translations, so some prayers you'll see the words thou and thy, and other prayers you'll read you. Just something I noticed going through it. You'll have the mysteries of the Rosary, various litanies, and since this is the modern missal, you'll have extras like the Divine Mercy. After the prayers, you get to devotions for confession, devotions for communion. You actually get a lot of info on communion. Vespers for Sundays, antiphons, an explanation of the liturgy, public worship and the Roman Church, and eventually the proper of the seasons. Now, as you can see, besides the font, the missal looks very similar to the Angelus Press Missal, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very well put together missal. Now, I don't know if it's just me, maybe it's the font, maybe it's the way that everything is spaced out, maybe it's the size of the English versus the Latin, maybe even it's that the pages are thin enough for me to notice the wording on the other page, but I've always found this missal a little hard to read or a little hard to get used to. Granted, I've never forced myself to use this missal like some of the others. I've only used it seldom times, but that's only because I'm not a fan of how it's put together. And you'll notice more when I'm at the order of the Mass. It just seems to me like the font is mashed together, not a lot of spacing, and it makes it hard for me to read. I don't know, maybe it'll be different for you, but what I've noticed is a lot of mushing together and a lot of empty, unnecessary spots and spaces during the Mass. Like the Angelus Press Missal, this missal will reference other pages in specific Mass readings, most notably after the 24th Sunday after Pentecost. If this missal was thinner like in the Angelus Press Missal or in the Marian Missal, I'd understand, but it's a thick missal and the pages are thin, so it would have been nice for them to simply include those readings on extra pages, but I digress. Finally, at page 895, you have the Asperges. A few pages after, you have the division of the Mass. It's really just a table of content on how the Mass is said. And on page 900, you have the ordinary of the Mass. Here, the Missal uses both black and red font to give notes on what the priest is doing, what you should be doing, what's happening on the altar, etc. This is what I mean when I say it looks a little convoluted. Unlike the Angelus Press Missal, this Missal uses the full page. There are no weird empty blank spots on the side of the page, but again, unlike the Angelus Press Missal, all of the notations are very close in font size as the actual Mass reading. Frustratingly, this font is very close together. It uses a lot of red and a lot of black. A lot of notes are right next to each other. Some of the font you're supposed to be ignoring when you're just reading through the Mass, but it gets a little convoluted. The Missal has explanations for the introit, the Kyrie, the Gloria, and that's cool, but you're effectively still getting empty spots when you're going through the Mass. Because there's so many notes that are so close to each other, it's wasted space. I mean, they're empty because in a perfect world, you won't be reading these parts during the Mass. Also, if you're barely learning, most likely you won't start with a missal this size or this price. Page 913 is a good example of what I'm talking about with wasted space. Paragraph for the collects. Paragraph, let us pray. Paragraph, amen. Paragraph, the epistle. Paragraph, thanks be to God. The gradual. Paragraph. That's not to say that these notes aren't useful, but it's wasted space to have it this large in the middle of the Mass. The Credo is broken up in 2 pages. Here you'll see the use of different fonts, which I understand why they're used, but if you're just reading quickly, it could confuse you. I is capital red. Believe, capital font smaller. 1, italics font, and it continues. It's just a lot of switching fonts. Again, I understand why the font has changed. It's to signify an important person or word in the prayer, but it just doesn't look well on paper. Again, my opinion. Also, what frustrates me in this missal is this missal will constantly break off on a new line during the prayer. It creates blank spots. It makes the prayer look longer than what it actually is, and it just doesn't look clean. There's not a lot of space between the lines either, so even though they are line breaks, it still looks mashed together. Ultimately, that's my biggest issue with this missal. There's way too much going on for my liking. There's way too many notations, too much unused space, and you really see this problem throughout the entire reading of the Mass. Going forward, you have the invocation of the saints. You have the usual Sunday communicant's prayer, and following that is the communicant's prayer for different days like Christmas, Epiphany, etc. I find it interesting that these communicant prayers are right in the middle of the missal, so you don't miss them, yet the different preface readings will be on a completely different page. Then you get to the words of consecration and the elevation of the consecrated host. Now, for whatever reason, the words, "For this is my body," are in a smaller, bold font, but they're not centered, they're off to the left-hand side. Passing that, you get to the consecration of the wine. This page has almost as much red as it does black, and it can be a little confusing if you're trying to read fast. Notice how everything here afterwards is pretty straightforward, spaced accordingly, not broken apart, very little red. It looks fine here, but then it gets convoluted again. At the end of the Mass, you'll have this giant empty page after the post-communion. I thought it was very weird. The conclusions could have been easily put on this page, but that's just what I think. At least the last Gospel reading is on its own page. The prayers ordered by the Pope or the Low Mass prayers are on the following page. However, it uses an English translation of the St. Michael's prayer that I don't think I've ever heard anyone say before, but nevertheless, it is approved. Continuing, you have the Mass readings for the Pope, martyrs, bishops, a lot of extra hymns, and vespers. Unfortunately, I've never been able to use this, but I'm pretty sure it helps someone who'd need them. Going to page 1096, the Proper of the Saints, as usual, this section will reference you to other readings on other pages. One thing I like is a brief history of the saint that you're reading. Here on St. Thomas, December 21st, it talks about St. Thomas's famous biblical interaction with the resurrected Christ in the Gospel. The Father Lasance Missal has a similar feature, however in that missal the Saint of the Day summary is way at the end of the missal section, dedicated simply to the saint of that day. Various commemorations are after, a lot of masses for different celebrations or prayer requests, also feasts celebrated in particular places and certain religious congregations. There are great masses like for St. Bernadette of Subaru and St. Benedict specifically for Benedictine churches. After those, you have the offices of Tenebrae in Holy Week, 40 hours devotion, and prayers to the Blessed Sacrament. Like the Angelus Press Missal, this section is way at the end of the Missal, and like the Angelus Press Missal, it'll also include the Litany of the Most Precious Blood. However, in this Missal, it's only in English. Proper of the feast celebrated in England and Wales is included, feast celebrated in Scotland is included, feast celebrated in the United States, here you'll have the Mass for Our Lady of Guadalupe, and lastly, feast celebrated in Australia and New Zealand. Overall, there's a lot in this missal. It's packed with so much, and it's very similar to the Angelus Press Missal. But in my heart of hearts, it's just not for me. I'm not a big fan of how everything is put together. I'm not a big fan of how big the book is. It's very bulky and it's a little tall. It's a great option for some, but for me, it's just not perfect. It's one of the most expensive missals that you can get. Probably the most expensive out of all of these. You'll probably find this at your church's shop, and it's a great option if you want to help out the church or if you just want to have everything that you can possibly think of. Lastly, we have My Sunday Missal by Father Joseph Stedman. This missal was mass-produced in the United States in the 40s and has multiple innovations over the years. Here I'm reading what I think is a 1945 missal, but the brand new reprint that's out today is the most up-to-date copy with the 1962 changes, and that's the larger book that I'll be reviewing today. There are also small changes that I didn't know about that might help the average reader included in this new reprint. There are several copies that have slight variations, a 1942 missal, a 1945 missal, a specific Lenten missal, and all of these are pocket-sized missals, so you really shouldn't have any issue carrying these with you to Mass. It starts with a calendar for the Mass reading, a table of contents, and a foreword that explains a lot of the faith, the Mass, and so much more. If you're into illustrations, this is a nice little missal to have. Small in size, but the illustrations are actually pretty large. Page 35, the Mass begins. Left side is Latin, right side is English. It's the standard setup for all missals that I've used. This is probably hands down the best missal that you can get if it's your first time at a Latin Mass. It's pretty straightforward. You have little markers on where to go. The Mass is numbered in sections so you can follow along with the priest. First difference from the reprints and the older copies, the older copies will have notes and markers in red ink. Unfortunately, the new reprints are only in black and white. The notes at the bottom of the missal are very useful also. You don't have time to read them during the Mass, but if you want to reflect on the Mass at another time, these are a great help. In the ordinary, you have the preface for the Most Holy Trinity, which is a preface that's used for most Sundays. I like that it's here in the Mass because you don't have to be flipping from page to page. In the 1962 Missal, the correct preface for the season will be in the Mass readings. Christmas Mass will have the Christmas preface, First Sunday of Lent will have the Lenten preface, etc. Unfortunately, the older prints will only have the preface for the Most Holy Trinity. The preface for Christmas, Lent, Holy Week, Easter, etc. are not included. So if you're planning on getting one of the older ones, maybe to save a little bit of money, or maybe you just want to collect them, or maybe you just think they look nicer, that's one thing to look out for. Also, this missal is only for low Mass. It doesn't have the extra prayers during a high Mass, and it won't give you notes on when to stand or sit. No asperges, it's all for the low Mass, so please take that into consideration before purchasing. Quick note, I've never seen this prayer in a missal before the elevation of the chalice. We beseech thee, therefore, help thy servants whom thou hast redeemed with thy precious blood. It's a 300 days indulgence prayer. I think it's beautiful, and everybody should be saying it at the elevation of the chalice. I started saying it after I was using this missal when I started getting into the Mass. Also would like to note that you can use this missal for the Mass of the Dead, the funeral Mass. Every time you see a black cross on the page border of the missal, it's indicating that that specific prayer is omitted during that Mass. It's to help you follow along easier. It's a good addition. Finishing up, you'll have all of the prayers after the Mass, which are all in English. And on the Latin side, you'll have spiritual communion prayers that you can say during the Mass or any time. Unlike most missals that have the Mass reading first, this missal will have the ordinary of the Mass first and all of the season second. I think it works fine. I have no issues with that. Most of these missals will not have a ribbon to keep your place, and so that can be a little frustrating. Some older Stedman Missals will have a ribbon, but most of them don't. You can always buy your own ribbon to keep in the book, or if you're confident enough, you can glue on your own ribbon. Because this is a smaller book, and because it's only for Sundays, you will not see cross-referencing for other Masses, but unfortunately, it ends with the last Sunday after Pentecost. So anything after the 24th week, like some calendar years may have, won't be specifically included in this Missal. You'll have to reference the calendar in the beginning of the book to know which readings are for that week's Mass. It's very annoying. This Missal does have holy days of obligation. Some are included in the regular readings, and others are included at the very end. For example, Christmas is at the end of Advent, Ascension Thursday is after Easter, etc. Lastly, there's a section called Every Catholic Should Know, and it shows the specific prayers that Catholics should know, and it references where to find the commandments. After that, you have your morning prayers, renewal of baptismal vows, the confirmation graces, evening prayers, and at the very end you have the Stations of the Cross. There's a lot in this little missal that would help a lot of people. You can kind of think of it as a study guide, or the book likes to see itself as a mini catechism. The Stations of the Cross are the St. Teresa's way of the cross. It's the same devotion, it's just a slightly different way of praying it, but you should have no issue. So listen, there's a lot going on all of these missals. There's a lot to like, and some things not to like. What you should be really taking from this video is, wow, any of these missals would be a great present for myself or for someone else. These are going to help strengthen your faith, help you in the Mass, help you with regular prayer life, and answer some questions of the faith you might have, and so much more. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. Hopefully I can make more videos like this in the future, and hopefully I can review other missals that you may have or have seen. I have a lot that I haven't gotten to, so I hope in the future I can do that. Thank you so much for watching this video, and God bless.